Hello class and welcome to Unit D on data collection. This particular unit is one where we're going to get away from the numbers. We're not going to be doing a bunch of calculations here. But it's a really important unit. If you think back to your first stats course, we gave you a data set, which was presumably collected using some sort of survey instrument, a questionnaire. Or we might have just made up the numbers. Or we gave you a problem which had all of the summary measures in it. So it was in a nice compact paragraph, and it said that a sample was taken of 100 people, and we got this for a mean and this for a standard deviation, and then it's asking us to do a hypothesis test. So all of the stuff regarding the collection of the data was done before, and we just assumed that it was done correctly. But in 307, what we're going to do is we're going to actually be working with a real client where we go out and collect the data ourselves. So you're going to have to come up with a questionnaire and a good method for collecting the data. And so we want to talk in this unit about how do you come up with that? How do you come up with a good questionnaire? How do you come up with a good sample design? And it really has to do with this concept, which you might have seen before, GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out. And all that's saying here is that if the original data is flawed or biased in some way because you've got poor questions or you used a poor sampling technique, then it doesn't matter what kind of statistical tests that you use or procedures. It's garbage in, you're going to get garbage out, if that makes sense. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're going right back to the beginning and talking about how do you make sure that the data that you have in your data set when you're ready to analyze it is good data, that it came from good representative sources and it used a survey questionnaire which was pretty sound. So let's take a look at that. Let's look first of all at some definitions here. And so a survey actually is both a noun and a verb. So we talk about surveying people, but a survey involves the collection of information about characteristics of interest from some or all units of a population using well-defined concepts, methods, and procedures. Yeesh. So we're going to take a look at what makes a good survey here. A questionnaire and then the survey sampling techniques. But we do want to distinguish here between a consensus survey and a sample survey. So a consensus means everybody. And so every 10 years, Stats Canada collects data from everybody in the country. Now, even they, of course, can't get everybody because there's people who are transient, or there's people who are don't have a home, or there's people who are hiding out in the bush for some reason, and so they can't get everybody. And that in itself is actually a problem because you're not surveying certain portions of the population here. But setting that aside here, the whole concept of a census survey is that you're surveying everybody. Now, as we'll see later on down here, is a population doesn't necessarily have to mean everybody in Canada. So we'll get back to that one. A sample survey refers to a collection of information about characteristics based on only a part of the population. So if we're talking about sampling Canadians, we might sample only 1,000 Canadians out of many millions. And yet we can still come up with some good representative results if we've got a good sampling technique. Population is the aggregate or collection of units to which the survey applies here. So when I talk about a population, you might think of all the people in Canada or perhaps all the people in Alberta, but it really depends on what the study is about here. So for instance, when I'm looking at Business 307 marks, you're my population. It's just a population of a little over 50 people here. And so that is much easier in that case than to get a census of people rather than a sample of people. The target population is the population for which the information is required. And so, again, we might be looking at surveying Canadian adults. But the survey population then is the population which is actually covered. And so hopefully they're the same, but there may be some differences. And so as I mentioned above here, that Stats Canada doesn't get everybody, every adult in their census count. And that is because there are some people who are homeless and some people who are transient and some people who don't want to be surveyed, so they're hiding out in the bush or something. And those are important people if we're looking at using that data to study issues such as homelessness or transiency. And so that can be a problem, although it usually isn't a big enough number of people when we're talking about a census of Canadian citizens here that it makes much of a difference here for most types of studies that we might use here. A frame is a list of the elements covering the survey population. So it can be a physical list or it can be actually a conceptual list here. A physical list would be, here's a list of all of the customers of this particular organization. So all the CPAs, you want to survey all the people who are CPAs. They've got their top accounting designation here in Alberta, and so the CPA has a list of all of the CPAs. And if you were able to get access to that, then of course you could survey all the CPAs by sending out an email to that frame of people. But it could be, let me just back up here in terms of a physical list here. If you're surveying, say, DBA students, depending on the type of survey that it is, if it's something that the dean wants information about, then you may be able to go to the dean's office and get a list of all of the emails of DBA students. So that would be the frame. A frame which we used to use in the past, but don't use much anymore, is a telephone book. And so a telephone book then is something that lists all of the different households or businesses, if it's a business survey, in Red Deer. Now the problem with that is that in the last 20 years or so, there's more and more people who have unlisted numbers and don't have landlines, and so you don't see their cell phones numbers in there. And so a phone book is not a great frame anymore, but it is still sometimes used here. A conceptual list is an interesting one in that it's, if you take a look at, say, surveying people at a Westerner Day events, well, you don't have a list of all the people that could be coming or are there. And so the conceptual list then is the number of people who arrive on that particular day or during that particular number of days of the events, if it's, say, something like Westerner Days. And so the example I've got down here is vehicles entering the provincial park between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. So that's the conceptual frame that we have here, not a physical frame. Last point down here is it says, for the purposes of sampling selection, the population should be divisible into finite number of distinct, non-overlapping, and identifiable units called sampling units. For the kind of sampling that we're going to be doing here, sampling units are persons. So you're going to sample people, and each person then is a sampling unit. Why would you take a survey? Well, there's a number of reasons why you take a survey, but here's three of the big ones here. So you want to influence or persuade some audience. So you can have a political survey or something, or a government agency, etc. Number two is probably a big one for what you folks would be doing here. Create or modify some customer service. So if you're doing a survey for, say, a restaurant in town or some retail store, then you're probably doing a customer satisfaction survey, and the the company is interested in finding out then, well, what do our customers think of our service, of our products, and so on, and that will help them then to improve their service or their products. Number 3 here, understand and predict human behavior, more in the area of, say, psychology and sociology and so on like that, less in terms of the kind of things that we would be doing, but certainly there can be an overlap there. Why would you take a sample instead of a census? So obviously a census is preferred, but often we end up, of course, doing a survey, and there's a number of fairly obvious reasons for that, but some may be less obvious, so let's take a look at them. First one is cost. The cost of examining the entire population is prohibitive, and so if we're talking about surveying Canadians, Stats Canada is probably the only one who can do that because they've got the resources from the government. It's actually millions and millions of dollars to do a census, which is why they only do it every 10 years. Time limitations, of course, time is money, but it also might mean that it takes a long time in order to get the results from everybody. So let's say we even have a list of all the CPAs in Alberta, and we send out to all the CPAs some survey. Well, we could wait until we got everybody's back, but there's some people that you might never get their survey back, and there's some that will take a long time to get back, and so at some point you just have to cut it off and say we've got enough. Number 3 here is the adequacy of sample results. That absolute accuracy is not always necessary for decision making. We've come up with a term before, which you've heard, which is the margin of error. And so we can calculate a margin of error for surveys. And so when we talk about surveying Canadians, if you survey, say, about 1,000 people, then you'll end up with about a 3% margin of error. And so that means that, let's say we find that 25%, let's give it a higher number than that. Let's say 60% of people say that they think the Prime Minister is doing a good job. And then we say that that's with a 3% margin of error. Then we're saying that we're 95% certain that it's somewhere between 57% and 63%. And we might look at that and say, well, that's actually good enough. We don't need to survey more than that. Number 4 is the destructive nature of some tests. And so, for instance, think of a manufacturing process, and you're doing quality control. Let's say we are producing springs, and so we want to make sure that a spring will hold a certain weight. And so what we do is we test the spring until it breaks to find out what its breaking strength is. Now, obviously, you're not going to do that with every spring that comes off the assembly line. So what they do is every 100th or 1,000th or 10,000th spring or something, they put it through a test. And they put a bunch of weights on until it finally breaks. And so that is a method then of quality control here. But you're obviously only going to do that with a small number of springs, maybe every 100th or 1,000th. Number 5 here is the physical impossibility of studying all the items in the population, and a good example of that is all the fish in the lake. So we just don't have access to all the fish in the lake, and that also goes back to surveying all Canadians, and so we just don't have access. Even Stats Canada doesn't have access to all Canadians, right? Some are out in the bush way up north, and that's a problem. And then the last one here is it reduces respondent burden. I remember one of the controversies many years ago, I think it's about 2 censuses ago, and so it's going back about 15, 20 years or so. And one of the big issues here was that the government came up with what they called a long census and then a short census. And about 10% of Canadians were given the long census. And the long census took a long time to fill out. So it asked not just questions like, who's in your household, what are their ages and genders and things like this, but it asked all sorts of questions like, your ethnic background and your religious beliefs and things like that, and a whole bunch of questions which took a long time actually to fill out. Now, I was hoping that I would get the long census, and I was probably the only one in Canada that wanted it. But of course, I'm a stats guy, and so I really wanted to see the long census and to fill that out. But it did apparently take about an hour or something for some people to fill it out, and so that's a lot of respondent burden. The short census only took a few minutes to fill out. It just wanted the basics, right? Names, or sorry, numbers of people in your household, their ages, that kind of stuff, and a few simple questions. So reducing respondent burden is an important thing here. Just before we end this particular first video here, who conducts the surveys and the polls? And there's lots of different organizations that do that in Canada. Here's the names of some of them. So Angus Reid and Ecos and Environics and so on like that. A lot of these actually will do the political polls, and so if you just go into Google and put in Canadian political polls, it'll take you to a lot of these, and you can see, for instance, at any time here, you'll see how people feel about the Prime Minister, and if an election was held today, who would they vote for? So they actually run these polls weekly, and they aggregate the results. So you can see actually the results from many, many different polls. Some of the notable companies in the United States here are things like Gallup. So Gallup is a really important one when we're talking about just general consumer interest and things like that, and even kind of goofy things like, do you believe that Elvis is alive or not? So they do that, as well as a lot of real serious kind of stuff. Harris, Ipsos, and so on like this. Nielsen ratings is an interesting one because that's how they figured out how whether a TV show should go or not. Should it be renewed for another season? That's one of the techniques that they have used for many decades. The way it used to work is they would actually send you a little booklet in the mail. So they contact you by phone usually and say, would you be interested in being part of the Nielsen ratings? And then what they would do is they would ask you to record in usually 15-minute intervals for a couple of weeks what your TV watching looked like. So most of the time, of course, it was just a big line right through because you were asleep or you might have been at work. But when you get into the evening, and so at 6 o'clock you turn on the news, and then at 7 o'clock you turn on this channel, and so you put down the channel and the show that you're watching and so on. And then you send the book back to them after a couple of weeks. They do that with radio as well. Even recently I've seen that with radio. And so that's a technique that they still use. With the Nielsen ratings, they moved to sending you an electronic box that you would connect up to your cable. And so it just automatically figured out what it was that you were watching. Now there's even other sophisticated methods in terms of finding out, who is tuning in through their provider and so on like that. So those give you the Nielsen ratings, and the Nielsen ratings then, if they're high, then the show is likely to be come back for another season, depending, of course, on its cost and the cast and so on like that. But otherwise, if it's got low Nielsen ratings, then there's a good chance that it will not be back. And so there's other ones here which are listed. The Stats Canada is the biggest gather of statistics in the country. And in fact, if you take a look at all of the ones above, the Canadian ones above here, Stats Canada gathers more than all they do together. So it's Stats Canada is big. And Stats Canada has traditionally had very good reputation around the world. There have been some issues actually with it even in recent years, and so its reputation has dropped a bit, but it has also worked to clean up its act. The other thing I should mention here then is that of course, there's another couple of different categories here. These are really the professional ones, the big professional ones. There might also be some local firms, so survey research firms. And so if you went to Google and you put in survey research firms and then Red Deer, you would find that there would be a list of a few different ones there. And so they're not the big ones like Angus Reid and Ipsos Reid and Leger and so on like that, but they do collect that. And then the other thing too is I'm just going to put this down as your own company. And so your own company actually may have a marketing research division or department, right? And then HR, of course, gathers lots of different kinds of stats. They can send out surveys to their members and so on. And then there's different things. There might be the finance department or something like that, or the HR, the production. Lots of different kinds of departments, but those ones in particular are big ones often. In a smaller outfit, a mom and pop shop, of course, they might just come up with a survey themselves for their customers. And so the survey that you're going to be doing with your client probably fits in that area there. All right, let's leave it there. And then the next section that we're going to look at here is survey errors. So let's end the lesson at this point. Thank you for listening.